Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. I've told you about the other three events. I should tell you that I am Steve Mitchell. I'm the co-owner of Scuppernong Books in Greensboro, North Carolina. And we're doing this horror series online so that we could invite people from all over to participate. I'm going to be letting people in as they come. And so now I'm going to let the panel introduce themselves, and then we'll start talking about horror.
All right. Well, thanks to Steve and Sophia, who's not here, but for organizing this. It's great to be. And everybody can hear me now? Okay. Sorry. My name is Joe Fletcher. I teach at UNC Chapel Hill. I teach a course in horror there. My research area is in the long British 18th century and Romanticism. I am an assistant editor at the William Blake Archive, and I do some creative writing as well, which has been described as horror poetry, which was a phrase I hadn't heard and didn't know I was doing until some editor told me it could be. So I rolled with it. But I've had a kind of long-standing fascination with horror, though I don't have any, super strong feelings about how to define it, but I'm curious to hear other people's thoughts and talk about it with y'all. So thank you.
Hi, my name's Govjian. I know Joe from UNC. I graduated there with a degree in medieval and Renaissance literature. And I've also just sort of had a long-standing fascination, preoccupation with horror. I did also teach the horror class there, and I also got to teach a sci-fi course where I inserted some horror, because how can you not? But currently, I work both as an independent scholar, but mostly in marketing. So all of my joys are through independent research, and I'm now writing a novel that bridges some genres, and one of those genres is horror. So I'm excited to pursue it creatively a little bit as well. And also, yes, thank you for having me. I'm really excited for our group discussion.
Yes, I'm Scott Romine. Thank you for inviting us. I'm an English professor at UNC Greensboro. I work mainly in the field of Southern literature and Southern studies. I'm currently teaching a class called Undead Souths, which borrows its title from a book of the same title, published in 2015. And the course looks basically at the idea of the Southern Gothic, how Gothic and grotesque literature is oftentimes associated with the kind of degeneracy and deprivation of the U.S. South. And I'm looking forward to the discussion.
I'm Maria Sanchez. I'm also a professor at UNCG, and I teach mostly, but not entirely, 19th century American literature. So that means a gallop through the Gothic, which is an important genre for the development of American literature. And I'm happy and eager to talk about all things Gothic.
Hi, everyone. I'm Karen Weyler. I am also a professor of English at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. I teach early and American literature, and my interest in the Gothic and horror dates back to a childhood fascination with an audio recordings of Washington Irving stories and Scooby-Doo, which is a parody of the Gothic and one of my favorite things to talk about when we talk about the Gothic. I have done some work in this area of my own scholarship, and that's with the American writer Charles Brockden Brown, who was crucial to the development of Edgar Allan Poe, whom I also hope that we get a chance to talk about today. One of the things I want to do in this discussion is kind of trouble those distinctions between Gothic and horror, and I know that Maria wants to as well. So I'm looking forward to this discussion, and Steve, I thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. Thank you all for being here. So folktales and myths were full of monsters and horrible things and creatures. So it's not that those things suddenly sprung up at some point. And I realize this is a controversial question, or a question that possibly can't be answered, But where is the demarcation line? Where do we say that horror begins as a literary form? That's a silence.
Well, are we going to go in alphabetical order again? I could speak to it a little bit. I don't. I'll just say that in the class that I teach at UNC, which is just an intro to horror class, so it's just kind of a gen ed. So I get a lot of folks with different backgrounds and different reading histories. So it's fun to kind of see where everybody's coming from. But I tend to try to do a kind of chronological journey with them, and we try to come up with some provisional definitions of what they take horror to be and what it does, what successful horror does, in both literature and film. And but I've started, like the last time I taught it, we started with Aeschylus, the Greek tragedian, and we read the Furies or the Eumenides, and we've done Dante, we've done Hamlet as a ghost story. So I know that probably, I don't know what others here think about, if there's a demarcation back there. Basically what I'm saying is I don't try to insist on one clean one. Certainly in the 18th century, one could say that when you started to have Gothic novelists like Henry Walpole or Horace Walpole, is Henry Horace? I'm losing the first name, but in the Castle of Otranto in the 1750s. But I'm hearing also that there's a need to distinguish Gothic from horror in this regard. So maybe others have different ideas about that. But we get into like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and Romantic era texts and go from there. And it seems like by the late 18th and 19th century, there seems to be emerging a kind of particular set of texts that we would now call horror for various reasons. But I don't know. That's just a starting point I can throw out there. I'm curious what others think.
Yeah, if we are going in our alphabetical order, I'm so thrilled that you bring in the classics and you bring in some early modern texts, because when I taught the horror class, same intro class, I did the same thing. We did it based on tropes, but I would do a sort of cluster of texts around different tropes, and obviously pulling on the great Gothic tradition, but thinking about what the roots of that are and what captured the imagination of the early 1700s and 1800s. And a lot of that is rooted in the period that I work in, which is late 15 to mid 1600s and sometimes earlier. So a lot of the texts that I look at are things like the Revenger's Tragedy, the Spanish Tragedy, Titus Andronicus. So these not horrible, great plays, but of horrible topics. They're sort of like the precursors to our understanding of the slasher in many ways, down to like, righteous indignation and punishment. So I root it a lot loosely as well, as far as like a historical pinning, but just to bring in what are the tendrils and sort of the larger historical context of literature that brings in a horror sensibility, because it just sort of seeps into a lot of things, even though the early modern period's genres are more copious, more blended.
God?
Didn't find my mouse. Yeah, so a general question for people in the panel to consider. When is Gothic actually in use? I mean, I was reading Richard Chase, who talks about Charles Brockden Brown, kind of pushing away from the idea of the Gothic in the introduction to, I believe it was Edgar Huntley. And I've read a manuscript recently for a book project that is submitted to a series I edit with LSU Press, that argues that basically the idea of an American Gothic literary tradition is a feature of the 1940s through the 1960s in critics like Richard Chase and in others of that era. But the idea of an American Gothic tradition, including Edgar Allan Poe, this manuscript argues is again a function of the 20th century. And I was looking through some introductions to Poe's work in the 19th century, and the word Gothic never appears. And in Poe's work itself, Gothic only refers to architecture, and in one case to a font type in the Fall of the House of Usher. So with any question of labeling Gothic horror, whatever term we're using, are we potentially committing an anachronism and retroactively assigning these labels to works of literature, works of art generally, that may not have been classified that way at the time of their production and reception? General question to throw out.
Well, and if at any point we get too professorial, please, members of the audience, beg us to take a step back, because I don't want you to feel like there's going to be a quiz at the end. But I'm going to see if I can pull this rug a little further. In the period I work in, which is generally about 100 years earlier than I think Scott's sort of favorite era, people are still arguing about what a novel is. What is the distinction between a novel and a romance? These kinds of genre categories like Gothic, like horror, like sentimental, like domestic, they are terms that are seized upon later by critics, by scholars, and used to try and pull together threads from the past and make sense of them. And one of the things I love about my time period is that I think when you were in it, it made zero sense at all. So, and, you know, I'm sure Karen will, you may have noticed, all of you out there, that in some ways, we've kind of lined up the UNCG folk. There's Karen, who starts a little earlier, and then my favorite time is sort of in the middle. There's got to be like a, you know, Three Little Pigs connection to this, or the Three Bears. I'll stop. And then, you know, Scott. But I would agree that some of these terms are, that most of our genre terms are retroactive. I don't think, though, that that means that there's nothing there, right? There's something that we're trying to use these terms to identify. And I can talk later about why I think Gothic is meaningful and useful, but I think Karen needs to chime in.
Thank you, Maria. I would agree with Maria that Gothic is a term around which scholars and ideas about what these texts are doing have coalesced. That was not necessarily what Poe himself used. Poe talks about this, and he talks about this in his 1840 collection of tales, Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque. In the preface, this is what he has to say. He says, "If in many of my productions terror has been the thesis, I maintain that terror is not of Germany, but of the soul. That I have deduced this terror only from its legitimate sources and urged it only to its legitimate ends." Okay, what does that mean? Well, when Poe is using this phrase, the terror of Germany, he is using that as his catchphrase for what was meant by the Gothic. And so he's talking about what had been happening in British literature, you know, particularly with someone like Radcliffe, in German writing and French writing, all over European. The Gothic has spread very often as a class critique. And so Poe recognizes that. But like many American writers before him, and I'm going to include Irving and Charles Brockden Brown in there, they all talk about the problem for them as American writers in trying to write this thing that is like what we know as the Gothic, or that Poe calls the Terror of Germany, is that they're in a new country. It doesn't have abandoned castles. It doesn't have haunted abbeys. So they have to then find a kind of new approach to terror. And what Poe says is this is the terror of the soul. So instead of the supernatural, instead of ghosts, instead of skeletons, Poe says what is most frightening is the inscrutability of the self. You cannot know other people, much less yourself. And he says that's terrifying. Emily Dickinson gets this. she says in a poem, it's a great, and I was thinking about Gothic poetry, Joe, if that Dickinson's poem, one need not be a chamber to be haunted, which is my favorite Gothic poem. She says, our self behind ourself concealed should startle most. So I think that is the one kind of fundamental difference for me between what most European Gothic novels are doing and then what happens with the American Gothic is they turn it and it becomes interior. And I think then that also sets us on a real trajectory to horror if you're thinking about, particularly about 20th century writers, and the rest of the panel might want to pick up there or the audience with questions and comments about that.
Thanks, Karen. I love that, what you all said, and Scott, what you proposed. I don't have a strong take on the American Gothic, but Karen, what you just said made me want to chime in about, you mentioned Anne Radcliffe, who, as folks may know, is British, late 18th, early 19th century Gothic novelist. But I also have my class read what I consider a pretty key essay, getting back to Steve's question. It's called On the Supernatural in Poetry. And she's making a distinction between horror and terror, and it's clear in 1826 when this essay is published that she's got these terms in mind, and she, like others in the period, pulls from Edmund Burke's essay on the sublime from the late 18th century, or second half of the 18th century, which was picked up by a lot of romantics. And you mentioned, I think Poe's word was obfuscation. What was the word, Karen? Or the inscrutability of the self. Burke's term obscurity is necessary for terror, for creating fear, for creating a sublime experience in the reader. And I think you can see that in the British tradition that I'm more familiar with, certainly in Poe as well, that it gets picked up in the Gothic. But for Radcliffe, terror aligns with the sublime and with the kind of more highbrow, we might say, literary devices, which she calls Hamlet, the slow build in Hamlet, and the psychological suspense that occurs in the ghost in the very first line of the play. Who's there? Getting back to Karen's question, who is there? Creates a sublime effect, creates terror, whereas for her, horror is a kind of a confused rush of images. And I always talk to my class about contemporary, like, slasher films, where you get that kind of onslaught of images that are gross outs in some cases, but really meant to kind of confuse rather than the psychological horror that we might be more familiar with, or we have different preferences in that regard too. So anyway, just thought I'd tack that on to what Karen was just saying. Thanks.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in on that as well, because I think iterations of that can be seen in you brought up Hamlet, Joe, but also, like, we have Macbeth and Othello as probably two other big pieces of the interiority made exterior through action and trying to see that tragedy on stage. But I think so much of the terror or horror, depending on how you define it, because they didn't use those terms necessarily in the period that I work in, but they were preoccupied with not just attempting to know the self and the other, but also to contend with what they thought of as, like, the threat of hell on earth. That's probably, like, the pivotal definition of horror for a lot of the folks rooted in the period. But then that sort of constantly is contending with interiority, which again is a more modern term that we place back on it, but there's evidence to understand the experience of the reader in the period or the viewer of a play. But then if we take it to something like Milton's works, and, like, the definition of hell is sort of like the mind is its own place, so it's always bringing it back to the self, and how the self can be this almost unending source of horror and hellscape.
So since you all deal with different periods in horror, and since Joe brought up the idea or used the phrase what horror does, I'm wondering, in your different periods, what does horror do, and how does it touch down on the people who are reading it? And who are the people who are reading it? Are they the people on the street, or are they all nobles? Or so that's like a 4-part question, I know, but but given the time frame that each of you are working in, what is horror about, and how does it touch the readers, and who are those readers?
Do you want us to go in order again, or
Yeah,
just?
Joe?
Oh, shoot. I was just going to say, I was just yapping. So I would, Maria, I'd love to hear your take on that. If you have one ready, otherwise I could try.
Well, I mean, when I have taught some late 18th and 19th century texts that either I would call Gothic, or that, I sort of do my little professorial hedging and I say they have Gothic elements, which is my way of getting around having to give them a great big name. I usually ask the students to think about related things, that some of the things that we're reading, like Charles Brockden Brown, whom Karen has mentioned, like Poe, even things like, say, Jane Eyre, that we're talking about the representation of worlds where there is unconstrained malevolence. And it is, I guess, one of the things I distinguish between are, monsters, I guess, the Bigfoots of the world, or something. That's the only monster I can come up with. In all the things that I'm interested in, the monsters are always people, right? It is people doing monstrous things. With some of the texts, like Brockden Brown, I asked them to think about it as a world without God, that a Gothic world is a world in which the kinds of institutional, deeply socially fundamental structures that give meaning to life are effectively not there. It's not that they're not working, right? Because that's sort of heading in the Dickens or the Stowe mold, where you have institutions to critique. In Gothic worlds, what I'm interested in is, a seeming just absence, that there is no God to appeal to, no church to appeal to, no functional church to appeal to, that faith is fake, that the law is absent, that everything that is supposed to be a quote unquote pillar isn't there. And that is terribly frightening, right? Especially if you think about early 19th century Americans who are living in a very young country that is itself an experiment. And no one can guarantee that this experiment is going to work.
So Maria, just the other part of the question of who is reading horror or Gothic, pardon me, whichever phrase you want to use, in your time period, is everyone reading it?
Oh God, no. But that has more to do with things like what was considered proper reading, and that's a pretty complex question. Can I punt?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, we can come back to it if you want, but
But we can at some point talk about the stigma around horror as a literary form. But let's do that later.
Yes.
Who else wants to talk about their period and what horror is about then, and who's reading it?
Maria, I think that Poe was very widely published in his lifetime. His reputation went down the tubes after he died, when Rufus Griswold wrote, his literary archenemy wrote a biography, which really set Poe into sort of the era of having a scurrilous reputation. But Maria's point is that about not everybody was reading these texts is true, because there's a whole kind of genre or subgenre of urban Gothic that really tackles and it falls into this category of the city novel, where it's examining the corruptions and lasciviousness of the city. So it's sort of sometimes a little trending on pornographic. I'm thinking about George Thompson, Venus in the City? Sorry?
Venus in Boston.
Venus in Boston. That's it. That's the one I was thinking about. So those novels were definitely not the proper novels, but they were popular and somewhat scurrilous, but also really tackling this idea of sort of urban crime, prostitution, those kind of things. But, there's another way that we see, I wouldn't say it Gothic novels, but Gothic elements entering into the literary period of the 19th century. And that is in talking about slavery. And we even see that especially in something like Hannah Craft's The Bondswoman's Narrative, where we see definitely a kind of Gothic treatment as a way to talk about, pressing social issues.
Ani, you want to chime in here?
Yeah, I would love to. So I think this is going to be super reductive, but kind of distilling a couple things. I think texts that have horror elements or that terrify did three things, at least. They did more, but things that would be useful for now is that they were meant to teach. So something like the Revenger's Tragedy, which I mentioned earlier, it's supposed to be this bloodbath on stage, but one of the lessons is don't do your own revenge. Like, revenge belongs to God, not to you. So they have these didactic impulses, but that's also often the excuse for putting on a bloodbath rather than the actual reason. Two, they're meant to anger people. So at least in the theaterscape, they angered Puritans quite a bit. All theater did, but especially horror, especially something like Faustus, where you bring devils on stage and have them parade around, have like all the sins that you can think of parade around. So that becomes a problem. So, and that was done with a wink as well. So angering some people. But I think the most important one, or the third one here, is they were meant to delight. The weird pleasure that comes from being taken up by fear and then having it not actually hurt you, and then to process it culturally. So in terms of like who is consuming this in a theaterscape, almost every echelon of society. Separate from that, obviously not everyone was literate. Most people weren't literate, but you also have this tradition of ballads being written. So think of it like newspapers that would travel from town to town. And if you weren't literate, there'd be people in town to read it to you, or more likely sing it to you. Sometimes it's silly things, sometimes it's happy things, but often it's news or rumors of, oh, did you see so-and-so birthed somebody who's actually a rabbit or many rabbits, and things like that. So it's like rumors of monstrosity that are gobbled up as gossip, as wonder, as sort of like the mix of abject, sublime. And a lot of that is just experienced as not necessarily frivolous, but something that both upsets and delights. So I think it's doing both.
Pat, you want to
Yeah,
chime
I'll
in?
maybe pick up there. The term Southern Gothic doesn't really exist until the 1930s. It gets attached to writers like William Faulkner, Erskine Caldwell in particular, T.S. Stribling, and a few others. And they immediately try to distance themselves from the label because the label is associated with low art. They don't want to be called Gothic writers because that signals to them a kind of grammar of monstrosity, to follow up on the previous points, abnormality, degeneracy, the grotesque. And so the category, at least insofar as I have any knowledge of it in any scholarly sense, pertaining to the literature of the U.S. South, is very much something to push away from. And it's perceived to have a kind of emphasis on deviance, which is an interesting question to ask. I mean, how do we think about labels like the Gothic and the grotesque with respect to more general paradigms of discipline and order as opposed to deviance and abnormality, because that threshold is often present. And insofar as I've said, the writers I'm looking at or have studied are concerned, they do not want to be labeled Gothic. That to them it has a very negative, low connotation associated with it.
I can just add, since I haven't answered that, but I can concur with Scott's point about in the British Romantic period that there's a similar attitude that poets like William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge in the preface to the Lyrical Ballads are specifically trying to distance themselves from the supernatural and the Gothic, as is Mary Wollstonecraft. And yet, at the same time, they're smuggling in Gothic supernatural elements, obviously, in poems like The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, Christabel, etc. So there's a kind of tension in the kind of trying to separate and load in a lot of literary allusions and distance oneself from what was regarded in the period as for those who were literate, a more kind of a lower genre to be reading, and that one should be elevated in one's reading concerns. So I think in terms of what it did, or what it should do, I mean, that's an interesting question to consider now and then. I mean, I think for the Romantics, there is, again, to be reductive, a kind of anti-Enlightenment project. And going back to Burke's definition of the sublime, if the sublime experience is one that shuts down the rational faculty, opens one to fear, and as Ani said, pleasure as well. There's pleasure to be had, and that's a key Romantic term. So there's a kind of the limit of rational intellect is reached in a sublime / horror terror experience. And I think that Maria, I don't disagree with your characterization of the kind of like devastated, godless landscape of horror that you described in your comment. But I also like to try to urge the students that when we talk about it in the kind of Romantic era and beyond, that horror can be a kind of liberating, kind of like a rupture to one's maybe solidified set of beliefs, worldview, etc. Like I like to think of it as a kind of, again, to the Hamlet quote about the, bounded in a nutshell, that those bad dreams come in, they slip in, and they open one to a kind of vista where there are other unknown, unrationalizable, uncognizable things at work, which can be, they often are horrific, but they don't have to be, is maybe the ultimate didactic lesson that Ani was talking about also. I always say that horror on the other end of the spectrum, humor does the same thing, a kind of rupture to one's kind of rational kind of bubble that we move through a lot of the day with, at least. So anyway, that's all for me.
I think we are a rupture. I mean, and I'll defer to my colleague, who would be, a few doors down from me if I were on campus. There is I should say, a very influential scholar, and I can see that we've got a couple of questions in the chat, so I'll make this brief, of American literature named J. Fliegelman, and he's probably been dead for about a decade now, but he was, I think, an early cheerleader. I can't think of a better word for this author that both Karen and I have mentioned, Charles Brockden Brown. And the way that he interpreted Brown was in some ways as an allegory of the fears that come up in the years immediately following the Revolutionary War. That, a realistic portrait of what this country was like at that moment, again, gives you no sense of a settledness. I mean, I don't want to sort of overemphasize it, but Great Britain, at the very least, has centuries behind it. This is an experiment. It's an experiment in government. It's an experiment in society. It's an experiment in how different sorts of people who have not lived together may or may not live together. And if I'm remembering Fliegelman correctly, because this is going back a few years to my grad school years, he reads Brockden Brown as very much saying that, we are ourselves, we Americans, the United States. It's the anti-Whitman. We are, in some ways, maybe we're a nightmare, or we can be. Karen, do you feel like I'm correct in that? It's been a while, actually. I should have consulted my Fliegelman, but I did not.
I mean, I think that is one way to understand the immediate post-revolutionary period is this idea about, it's kind of patricide, things are spinning out of control. And certainly that's what Brockton Brown is writing about. But again, it's also inflected by these sort of ongoing struggles, like the fact that slavery was not decided, that it was still existed. Brown was opposed to slavery. He was a Quaker, for example. So you do have this, I think, fiction and American fiction, Gothic fiction, really taking up, and not just fiction, but other genres that adopt these Gothic tropes to really grapple with this unsettledness of the United States that Maria is talking about. I mean, I see there are some questions in the chat, and we've been talking a lot about the early period, and I see that Philip Kressler asked about what separates modern horror from Gothic horror, and I wonder if we might maybe take a turn more to the contemporary period.
Yeah.
Who wants to jump
I don't
on
have an
that?
answer for that. That's why I'm punting it to everyone else.
I think I mean, one of the things I'm feeling is I'm not quite sure what you're talking about when you use Gothic as opposed to horror. I'm not quite sure, and here we are into something that 4,000 books have been written on the distinction between these two things. But I think it might be helpful if we could get just a kind of simple idea of, and maybe that's what Philip is asking, what actually is Gothic horror, maybe as opposed to modern horror.
I mean, I can sort of describe what I think some of the differences are. So for instance, if I were to think of what modern horror is, I do tend towards a dwelling on graphic elements, graphic depiction of violence of all kinds, and maybe actual monsters, for completely different reasons. I sometimes have conversations with students when we're trying to talk about the difference between the I, who speaks perhaps in a narrative, and an author, right, who created that. I ask them to think about genres in which they do not make this easy connection between what they're reading on the page and the name of the person as author. And I say, Stephen King is supposed to be a really nice guy. He's got like a rock and roll band, and, he has never been a killer dog, a killer car. He has never been these things. He writes about them. And I guess that's what I think of. I think of things that then bend reality, which is different from the kinds of texts that I look at, where I think Gothic is more about things going wrong, oftentimes because of someone's malevolent actions, and you may not know who that someone is for several hundred pages. But the monster, to go back to the Emily Dickinson poem that Karen quoted, the monster is always going to have a human face. And sometimes one of the scariest things is discovering that the monster, has your face. So no actual monsters, and maybe more mishaps, horrible things happening, but no kinds of graphic descriptions. I mean, I'm thinking about things like Halloween or all of those movies, and that's not my bit. So that's what I would make as a distinction, maybe something to do with the violence.
Just to throw a question out there, and I have no answer to this. I'm not sure we ever mean the same thing when we use the term like Gothic or horror. They're very fluid conceptualizations. Does the supernatural or does the Gothic require a supernatural element? That is, I think, one differentiation that is made or can be made between the two terms and what they describe. I'd be interested in hearing whether supernatural or out-of-body experience, if we want to conceptualize that through the sublime or in some other way, but something that invokes what Zev von Todorov calls the fantastic, that moment of hesitation where we're not sure if what we're experiencing is part of the world as we understand it or some different world, whether it's part of the natural or part of the supernatural. I mean, it strikes me again that the Gothic oftentimes is a genre designation applied to texts that complicate that question.
Coming from a person who's like not its field it is to like be rooted in the Gothic, when I think about your specific question, Scott, I want to say like what's more required, if there is a requirement, is the suspicion of the supernatural, or the potential anticipation. Whether that plays out as being what's in play necessarily is maybe the question, the emotional stake. Whether it's a true like Anne Radcliffe novel, or if it's something like James's Turn of the Screw, where it's like, are there ghosts, or is our nanny just, you know, really emotionally unstable? So I think, but I do think that's a really interesting question to posit, because I don't think that my answer is meant to hand wave the supernatural away. I think it actually, the supernatural, to your point, is very important, but I don't know that it has to be there at the end, just sort of the specter of it. Even that like use of specter feels like maybe a cop out, but that's not how I mean it. It's like, I feel like we can't escape the potentiality of the supernatural.
I think that's a great point to make. And I would agree entirely that the Gothic tends to, it almost always raises the issue of the supernatural, even if it ultimately dismisses it. And Poe's story, The Black Cat, does that. There's all these elements that sort of seem supernatural that the narrator is imagining, but they're all actually easily explained away. I mean, I guess what I would also say, something that along with this idea about this kind of raising the specter of the supernatural, is that the Gothic tends to do is also draw upon the uncanny. And again, things that may or may not be able to be explained away. That's not to say that we might not see the uncanny in horror, but I don't think that's the point of horror. And, you know, I'm really struggling here to think about horror, because when I think about horror today, I think about film more so than novels. And when I think about the Gothic, I think more about novels than film. I'm not saying you can't have Gothic films and you can't have horror novels, because obviously you can, but I think where the audience for these things today largely is for horror is in film. And it seems to be, you know, sort of serial repetitions of whether it's Saw or Halloween or Friday the 13th. And, you know, those things also certainly have Gothic elements, but there certainly is a kind of level of repetition of kind of graphic violence that was off the page in the 18th and 19th centuries.
Karen, that's really an interesting thing, thought about the thoughts of like, what's the association with modern horror versus Gothic, and what kind of text it's rooted in. And so just remind me of something, an episode of Black Mirror called Playtest. I don't remember what season, but I know that's called that, plays with what we think of as stereotypical Gothic tropes, but then puts it in a modern context because it's somebody playtesting a video game. But it, in addition to just sort of like, the curtains of Gothic with you know, spooky houses and things like that as part of the video game, I think what's interesting about that one is it plays with themes that might come out of certain Gothic novels, like the generational pain of like being a child and like not living up to expectations, the way like a lot of our heroines who are running around these castles are doing, but it's sort of flipped. So I just wanted to put a plug for that episode. Not that I like endorse everything that Black Mirror does, but it's just useful, I think.
So Alan Brown has a question that I'm gonna shorten a bit. Can you comment on the public reception of Shelley, Poe, and other 19th century writers, and the extent to which readers were shocked, thrilled, entertained, or repelled by the stories? Was it controversial? And further down, is the South the only region of the country known with this one distinctive genre, Southern Gothic? So let's go from there. Contemporary reception to Poe and Shelley and others?
Oh, I actually wanted Scott to say more about Southern Gothic earlier, so
Yes.
maybe.
You're muted, Scott.
Yeah, I mean, again, when the term Southern Gothic emerges, it is not in the terms we've been discussing, in terms of the sublime or in terms of the supernatural. It is in terms of abnormality, monstrosity, degeneracy, and the grotesque. So I think the term, although it gets retroactively assigned to Poe as the father of the Southern Gothic, whether Poe is a Southern writer in any meaningful sense or not, I will leave an open question. So we're talking about a different understanding, different baseline understanding of what the Gothic is. And I think in many ways, the Southern grotesque is a better label for what is oftentimes assigned the tag Southern Gothic. And yes, in that sense, I would suggest that the South probably has overrepresentation in texts that emphasize deviance, abnormality, et cetera, et cetera. The South has always been viewed as kind of the exception to American exceptionalism, for better or for worse. And so the idea of the South as a region of extremity, certainly a region of extremity insofar as violence and bodily suffering is concerned, there's a long tradition of that.
Thanks, Scott. Thoughts on contemporary reception to writers?
That's a chew on that. There's certainly a kind of novel, James Lee Burke comes to mind, and he'll have a ghost or two, but there's certainly Wiley Cash, Ron Rash, the idea of the dirty South. They seem to sell. I mean, we have a recent graduate, Scott Blackmore, who published a book that I would call Southern Gothic, as that term is contemporarily understood. Gritty, lots of violence, usually a crooked sheriff or two, family secrets being revealed, some kind of resolution, oftentimes involving racial reconciliation or the lack thereof. I mean, there's a kind of template that's out there that you can write the spec for, and people do.
So maybe Joe can speak specifically to Shelley. I don't know that much about the reception of Frankenstein, and I think Karen could say a little bit more about Poe if people are interested in that. In some ways, it does depend. Reception depends on the author, and as Karen was saying earlier, 19th century America has all of these different types of narratives and poetry as well, where you can certainly talk about Gothic elements. There was a flourishing industry, I mean, maybe a minor industry, but it was there was always something to be sold in terms of trial transcripts, and the more lurid and the more spectacular, the better. And frankly, our newspapers of the era would probably shock you with how, quote unquote, unprofessional they could be, at least by our modern standards. There were several murders, and they were usually murders, either of prostitutes in the early 19th century, of abandoned and fallen young women who became inconvenient for their lovers, that turned into trial transcripts that eventually found their way into the works of other authors like Poe. His story about Marie Roche, am I getting it wrong? Marie Roger? I may be getting it. That's Mary Rogers. And there was all kinds of literature about Mary Rogers before Poe picked that up. I mean, just briefly, I'll say that in my classes, we are currently even playing this game in one of my classes where we talk about who audiences would have been or should have been, and it's a way of getting them to think about what who had access to particular types of writing. And one of my students has been designated since about the second week as the protective elder brother of 5 younger sisters whom he needs to marry. And they are not allowed to read a lot of the things that we are talking about. He would protect them from these sorts of materials if he could, and they would probably try and get a hold of them if they could. But who can read certain things often has to do with who that person is, as well as access, where they're going to get it, what kinds of money they have, all that sort of thing. So I know that was in many ways a non-answer, but hey, what do you do?
Well, I can talk about Poe. So one important thing to know about Poe is that he edited 4 different literary magazines during his very short life. And he had the same problem that many editors in early America had, is one of content. They needed material. So Poe frequently published his own material, and he published it in others' periodicals as well. So Poe was very well received in that time period, but it wasn't really enough to make much of a living, just because of the kind of early stage of print capitalism at that time. It would really be another decade or 2 before writers could support themselves. Then, as I mentioned earlier, after he died, his worst literary enemy, Rufus Griswold, gets to write about him, and does quite a hatchet job, not to make a terrible pun there, but I did, on Poe's reputation. But Poe's reputation continues to be very strong, particularly among the French. When Freud writes his essay in 1919, The Uncanny, he's using Poe as his primary source of evidence. So Poe still has some credence. But as to who would have been reading Poe in his lifetime, well, only middle-class people or the elite, because those are the only people who can afford to buy books and periodicals in the 30s and 40s. So it would have been a pretty elite audience. At that time, would have been the only people able to buy his materials. So Joe will have to talk about Shelley, because I can't tell you anything about how Frankenstein is received.
Well, I won't take up too much time with this. I don't have a broad sense of how her reception extended, Shelley's reception extended later into the 19th century, but certainly Frankenstein, 2 famous editions were published 1818, and as the circumstances of her writing the novel itself were pretty captivating, let's just say, and we don't need to go into it here, but so there was an 1818 edition, which is the one that's kind of more commonly read now, and then there was an 1831 edition. It was also brought to the stage in her lifetime as well. And there were a lot, there was a lot of critical reception, reviews written in all the kind of widely circulated publications at the journals of the time. It didn't catapult her into some kind of comfortable status, and her life is pretty tragic, all things considered. And she did publish 2 more novels, Valperga and The Last Man, after Frankenstein. So into the Victorian period, I'm not sure how Frankenstein fared, frankly. But I always, when we read it, I think about 20th century film adaptations, and the longevity in the life of that novel is still staggers me when I just thinking about it. And she was so young when she wrote it. It's just an amazing. There's so much to explore in a classroom setting and just as a novel. So I'm continually amazed. I love to teach it and reteach it, but I don't have a whole lot to say about its kind of contemporary reception.
We have 2 other questions I want to get to quickly that anybody can throw their hat in the ring here. Do you have any insight into the use of folktales in your respective areas, and how these folktales relate to horror in the past and or the present?
Yeah, I'd love to touch on that.
Yeah.
So I think in terms of my respective area, folktales were still everywhere, sometimes called old wives' tales, and they're brought up in a lot of interesting ways. So I mentioned the play Dr. Faustus. Dr. Faustus as a figure makes his way from Germany to England as a folktale. And I particularly love this question because it's about like the mobility of stories, right? And so I love that Baba Yaga is everywhere right now, whether it's like in a children's book or a video game or like an adaptation of the Witcher series. You know, there is something about the stories we tell around a fire that like have a grip on us. And at least as far as in theater, in the field that I work in the most, they were in play in sorry about the pun, but they were in play in plays in a very specific way, or in multiple ways. One is they're always acknowledging folktales. There's riffs, there's allusions, and sometimes whole plots borrowed and reformulated. So sometimes it gives the play legitimacy because it's a buy-in for the audience, and sometimes it gives the folktale legitimacy. So it's a back and forth. And in a way, it's not to be too hokey about this, but it's kind of like TikTok about like the reformulation of stories that we love, and it's like, and then the stitching together, and then who told it better. So that comes in over and over and over again, and then it lasts the test of time. And not to elide too much with this question, but I think folktales allows us to talk a little bit about folk horror and the folk horror revival we're having. So even with something like the 2015 movie The Witch by Robert Eggers, or the show Yellow Jackets, we have or even all the renditions of Wicker Man, we have this idea of small communities and communities, whether they're rooted in a historical culture like in Wicker Man, or communities that are made up of like, okay, a soccer team that's abandoned somewhere and having to contend with the supernatural, that allow for an overwhelming sense of union, and then going to the next question that I see, like disruption, like a breaking of the community. And so a lot of these folktales play around with what defines us and how does the definition we have stand up against disturbing things that can happen to us or the stories that we tell. So that's sort of how I see like the connection also between folktales and folk horror, and then maybe bringing us to Mary's question about disruption and potential threads.
Yeah, and
So
Mary's
I wanted to just,
I'm sorry, go ahead, Karen.
Oh, okay. I was going to add that in American literature, Irving uses folktales pretty extensively, particularly the Legend of Sleepy Hollow. He was very open about using his sources from Dutch and German folktales. And what he has to say about this, he talks about this as an essay. Like he's totally honest. Like, this is what I'm doing. I'm kind of reworking these tales. And he says this is what it's called. He calls it literary metempsychosis, where he says there's only so many stories on the earth, and what we do is, as writers and creators, we simply recycle. We write them for new audiences, and we create them new. And he says that in an essay called The Art of Bookmaking. And I love that because it's this idea that people write for their own age, the stories that their age needs. And that speaks to this question of disruption. So that the story Rip Van Winkle is about, on the one hand, seems about a guy who walks away in the mountains and gets drunk. On the other hand, it's really a story about the disruption of the American Revolution and how that's changed life for all these people in these small villages, or not changed life.
Yeah. And if I could chime in here, another writer whose name might be mentioned is William Gilmore Simms, who's very interested in folk tales. He also wrote a really great story. Poe called it the greatest ghost story in American literature. This is 1840, so there have been many since that he wasn't comparing it to, called Grayling or Murder Will Out. And it's very much about the residues of revolutionary violence in South Carolina, which was a very divided state. And the story involves a Scotsman who had fought on the British side, we learn later on, murdering for money a patriot. And the story is framed as a ghost story. Is the crime solved because an actual ghost appeared, or is there a rational explanation for why the person may have thought he saw a ghost, or simply invented this as a way to get this guy arrested that he was already suspicious of? That question remains unresolved in ways we talked about in other kind of moments of the fantastic, with the supernatural and the rational. There are equally plausible scenarios as far as how the events are interpreted. But Simms emphasizes, I think, that America needs its own ghosts, that it needs its own folk tales, that it needs its own mythologies. And he was part of what was called the Young America movement literary nationalism. And so for Sims, creating an American literature was not simply borrowing folk tales from old England, but creating new folk tales, creating new stories about ghosts, creating new stories about traumas that had been seared into the American consciousness. And that was very much part of his project of literary nationalism.
Anyone? So I think a lot of you kind of spoke to Mary's question about, would it be accurate to say that we attach the title horror to anything that upsets some kind of status quo in a disturbing way, whether that's a personal status quo or spiritual, physical, mental, cultural. And I think a couple of you have spoke to that as, or have given that a yes, shall we say. Does that make sense? But the
I would
idea
just
of
like
horror,
to add an ancillary thing. It
yes.
is a yes plus, okay. It's also the vibes. Because I want to say, and not to like plug my field again, but even with something like Romeo and Juliet, I think there's something about, at least in the period that I work in, that is not, it is obsessed with labeling, obsessed with genre, but then doesn't stick to genre. So there's a whole scene where Juliet in the crypt daydreams about potentially losing her mind and then messing with the bodies of her family in this crypt. And then what if she then gets so like taken away by this fear and insanity that she might like dash her brains out with like the leg of one of her relatives. It's like a really it's a horror scene. It's a horror interlude. We have like little bips of that in other comedies, like in Midsummer Night's Dream. It's like, we better go back, all fairies, because like the zombies are looking for their graves because they crawl out every night, and they don't use the word zombies. But so I don't think that definition is wrong. I think it's actually a really beautiful definition. And I think the something about like upsetting status quo is probably even in the moment with Juliet, because, you know, maybe little girls who are 13 years old and shouldn't be thinking about all this as after they've gotten secret married. But I think it's both that when it comes to a conceptual problem, but also not to let go of the aesthetic sensibilities of horror. And I think there's something to aesthetics that's still really important.
And if I can jump in with that, with thanks, Ani, that's great. I like the vibes too. And one term that comes up for me a lot in my thinking about it and talking about it with students is in terms of upsetting, I'll latch onto the physical, our kind of physical understanding. We talked a lot about kind of American society and post-revolutionary, early 19th century, et cetera. But there's also this notion that in my work, I like to think about kind of matter theory, and the word panpsychism comes up, and it comes up for Poe as well, and Usher. This, you know, Roderick has that, he's kind of espouses this theory, then he's alluding to, you know, contemporary work in the field of natural philosophy on this notion that what if non-human entities and non-organic entities have a kind of psychic aspect to them, an anima, to use a kind of classical term, that is distributed beyond humans and animals and even vegetables. And that is a kind of a specter, to use that term, Ani, again, or Maria, that floats through that work, but also, you know, that's a kind of disruption to, you know, panpsychism has, you're seeing it more and more in kind of contemporary physics these days, and philosophy of mind as well. But like, I think horror, that's a good example of a kind of, you know, I watch a series like Paranormal Activity, and you can talk about covens and stuff like that, but I love cameras pointed at suburban hallways at night, and I could just watch those grainy clips forever. No witches need to come. I'll just watch that. And to me, that what the suggestion is, that the houses that we've built, that there is a kind of like folkloric, you know, quality of what we've done that we're not quite aware of, that the house is somehow alive, obviously, in the haunted house trope, right? Anyway, just wanted to tack that on there as well.
If I could quickly do a kind of shout out to a couple of very contemporary things. I do have one class that I teach that looks only at contemporary things. All the authors have to be not only living, but they can be no older than I am, which actually is some space. But anyway, this is one of the most successful things I've taught over the last few years, Mexican Gothic. I think the novel is maybe 3, at most 4 years old. And that and 2 books by this author, Isabel Cañas. The other one's called La Hacienda. This just came out a couple of, maybe at most 2 months ago, Vampires of El Norte. Both authors, in interviews that I've read with them, are really interested in sort of taking on, at least maybe sort of teasing the label Gothic. And they do something that I think all of us in different ways have touched on. There are monsters. I don't want to give away too much because I want people to go and read these, but whatever monsters there might be are deeply, deeply human. There's just like the thinnest veneer of something that is supernatural. So thinking about what Scott said earlier, in some ways it's sort of blurring the boundaries, what is human, what is not quite human. And they're also interrogating, colonialism, imperialism, different ways in which Mexican people, in which the borderlands have been, the subject of some monstrous regimes. But they're not graphic, they're not gross. I actually, had a couple of students who were like, oh, I was so afraid to read this because I don't like scary things. It's creepy, but not scary. And I have not met anyone, either student or non-student of mine, who has read this and not liked it. And I saw a couple of other very appreciative nods. And as for, I'm just started this, but her first book, La Hacienda, I read in about 36 hours. I could not put it down. I was like staying up later than I should have on a weeknight to do it. So, go read Mexican Gothic and Vampires of El Norte.
Aaron, Scott, last word.
I second Mexican Gothic, and I'm looking forward to reading the Vampires of El Norte, Maria. I haven't read that one yet.
And the La Hacienda. La Hacienda is, I love it.
Folks.